My name is Marshall Ledford, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Arizona in the US. My background is generally focused on trying to understand how microbes interact with the atmosphere, particularly focusing on which genes or genetic traits might be driving microbe-atmosphere interactions. I think volatile organics are a really interesting aspect of trace gas metabolism. I think a lot of times there's a really big focus when we think about the atmosphere on things like greenhouse gases, so methane, carbon dioxide. But ultimately, a lot of these other more trace components of the atmosphere are really important for understanding how microbes interact with each other and the influence that they have on the environment. Ultimately, trace gases really are this sort of big unknown in our comprehensive understanding of how biology is influenced by and influences the atmosphere. For this project, we were really interested in the process of primary succession. So as glaciers melt, they expose land surfaces that get quickly taken over by life. And over time, that life develops that surface into a fully functional soil capable of supporting plant species. So directly in front of the glacier, you have this really nutrient deficient, really inorganic, low biomass soil. And as you move further and further away, representing more time that that soil has been uncovered, you get this interesting gradient of development all the way out into a tundra. So we were really interested in understanding how this process of soil development over time impacts the way that that soil interacts with the atmosphere. For this collaboration with Volt, we're actually able to use a lot of the instrumentation that exists here to study the gases that are being cycled in the soils, both in the fields and then back in the lab. And then the soils that we have taken, the samples, will be brought back to the University of Arizona to perform some sequencing analyses and understand actually which microbial species are existing and interacting in that soil. For this project, we had a couple of different approaches to understanding how gases are being cycled in the glacial forefield. And so two of those involved actually going out and setting up measurement systems which could sort of soak up any gases that were in the environment and then be brought back to the lab to understand the composition of that gas. So what compounds are existing in that environment, and does it change as you go from being right up in front of the glacier, even on the glacier, all the way out to the tundra. Our second approach was actually bringing soils back into the lab in petri dishes and just taking measurements of the gases that were being emitted and taken up by the soils from different locations in front of the glacier. Mitterloevenbrunn, which is the glacier we were in particular looking at, is a really studied, well-studied system for understanding soil development dynamics. So there's been a lot of work to understand how the microbiology changes extending out from the glacier, as well as information about the nutrient availability in the soil, the carbon availability in the soil. And so we thought that this sort of gas measurement approach would provide a unique perspective on a system that we really know pretty well already. I think that Svalbard, because of sort of the unique features that go along with conducting research in Svalbard, the polar bears, the difficulty in getting to the field sites that might be there, there isn't a ton of data specifically on trace gases that are being cycled in Svalbard. So it kind of adds an additional data set to the information that we already have about trace gas cycling in the Arctic. But it is also, like I mentioned, one of the fastest warming environments in the Arctic. So it gives us this window into the future for what some of those other systems might look like. I think Svalbard is a really exciting place to do research. I think one of the big sort of draws to doing work there is specifically the fact that Svalbard is one of the fastest warming locations on the planet, if not the fastest. And so I think it gives us a really interesting perspective on what we might expect in other ecosystems that are experiencing warming throughout the Arctic and Antarctic. I think that working in Svalbard has some really unique quirks, I guess. One of the biggest ones being the presence of polar bears. And so anytime you are in Svalbard, if you ever get to visit, whether you're at a research station or in one of the main towns, you'll quickly notice that on the perimeter of all of the settlements, they have these giant signs letting you know that beyond this point, there is a polar bear threat. And so you have to take some really unique precautions, for example, doing rifle training or carrying a flare with you out into the field so that if there is a confrontation with the polar bear, you're able to defend yourself. Now, obviously, the focus is more on preventing those confrontations from happening in the first place, so we have really intense training on how to stay away from polar bears, what their sort of movement patterns are, how to spot a polar bear that might be far in the distance. And then of course we have different, non-violent methods of scaring polar bears away. But I think this sort of paranoia that can come along with constantly having to look around corners and look over your shoulder is certainly an interesting aspect of working in Svalbard.